Whilst we're talking about huge miscarriages of justice, let's talk about a genuine one for a second here, which is the topic that you've been reporting so much on over the years, Charlie, and which also was a large part of why you've won this reward, very deservedly so, is the grooming gang scandal, which has, over the past few months, got right back to the top of the political agenda. We're recording this, a week or so after the Casey audit. This is Baroness Casey's review into all the available evidence about the grooming gang scandal, both the perpetrating and the cover-up to a certain extent, which has forced this U-turn from Keir Starmer. Originally was rebuffing calls for a national inquiry, claiming that people calling for it were, quote, jumping on a far-right bandwagon. Well, he's now boarded said far-right bandwagon himself by saying that he accepts the recommendations of the Casey review and that we are going to plough ahead with this national inquiry. I think people who have been paying attention to this issue don't need to be reminded about the horrendous crimes themselves up and down the country, thousands of victims. I know GB News have found at least 50 towns and cities across the UK in which this abuse of predominantly very poor and working class white girls by predominantly, disproportionately, I should say, Pakistani Muslim men. And one of the things, hopefully, about the review is that at very least puts pay to the idea that those claims were just a kind of racist conspiracy theory, making the point that there's not a hell of a lot of data available, but where there is data, it very clearly points to this disproportion. But have you got any kind of reflections on what this review means and what could happen next? Because there's always the danger that an inquiry such as this just becomes an exercise in can kicking and whatnot. But what's your kind of general top-line take on where we're at with this long-running scandal?
The top-line take is that it's vindication for those who've cared and not let it go away. Right, and that's predominantly the survivors, their families and campaigners, but also the various media outlets, and very happy to include GB News, that have given this the full weight of rigour that it's required. Even as recently as the start of this year, when interest in this surged, when Elon Musk got involved, people were still asking the question, perhaps now a bit more quietly, why are we still talking about this? This was all something in the past. But of course, the figures asking that, some of them, within Labour, obviously, some of them within those left-wing circles, their friends and allies at the same time were saying, we don't need to talk about this because we're making loads of arrests. We're protecting thousands of victims. As they were denying the issue, they were celebrating the fact that they were taking action to destroy the issue. So it's vindication for those who've cared about it and put it back on the agenda and shown that there are more things to reveal, more scandals, more cover-ups involved in this. Jack Elson from The Sun, I think, asked that question of Sir Keir Starmer in January, that fated press conference where he said the far-right bandwagon at a hospital in Surrey, in Epsom. Jack, I think, asked the PM, are you confident that every cover-up has been exposed? He did dodge the question. He basically said, we've had these inquiries already, referring to the ICSA reports. And then later he said, we don't need any more research. I thought that was a really strange line, because there was a political opportunity, of course, which he used to say, we don't need another inquiry. To say we've had the inquiry for ICSA. Even though it was a sham, it didn't look at grooming gangs. I think your audience will know that. It looked at just 6 areas and none of them had this pattern of abuse. To say it didn't need any research was a really strange thing to say. Because a week later, he commissioned someone to do loads of research. Almost 200 pages were printed last week. And she pointed to the absence of information, how this issue has been so difficult for people to engage with. There's a whole chapter called Denial, chapter 6, and that points to the fact that people haven't gathered that information. So much of what should be gathered, the academic information, fascinating conversations and investigations into links between cousin marriage and grooming gangs, about clannishness, about in-group loyalty, about moving foreign cultures and modes of feeling and thought around women to post-industrial Victorian mill towns. That should be a fascinating area of academic study, but it hasn't been done. So Keir Starmer said on January the 8th, I think, we don't need any more research, we just need action. I happen to think we need both. I'm glad that he now thinks that. And my colleague Christopher Hope, our political editor at GB News, he says, I think, quite a lot, that Keir Starmer isn't a cynical political creature. He's quite a natural person. He genuinely thinks things like this. He thinks like a lawyer, like a civil servant, which is a source of criticism for him as well, of course. And I do think he genuinely felt, we've taken action, we've got this task force that the Tories launched, and we've already had an inquiry, so we'll just crack on with that. That's what victims want. But actually, there's obviously loads more to do. And I think what Casey's report has exposed is how much the state and the system has relied on a racial myth, basically, to stop people from getting involved with this. They've relied on that 2020 Home Office report that said that, most abusers must be white because we haven't got the data and therefore we just assume it is, which was fashioned up by The Guardian in an op-ed and then used to beat everyone on the head for years, including our own coverage. But that's all gone now, and all the people who said that have been remarkably silent. Many people who passed that myth around have deleted their posts. So it does really feel like a corner has been turned. On the second question, what do we need to do now? How do we feel about this inquiry? Well, I think, for a lot of people, it's a sort of a painful realization that the work starts now.
Yeah.
To make sure that this inquiry asks the right questions of the right people, compels the right evidence, compels the right witnesses. Because if it doesn't, it risks becoming another ICSA. We don't need another probe into Warwickshire that ignores Bradford. But I think I'm hopeful that we'll get the right one.
Can I ask you a couple of questions? Sorry.
Please,
No, go for it.
Firstly, how much is this still going on, do you think? And secondly, will the inquiry potentially lead to people getting their comeuppance? Could it lead to criminal prosecutions?
Yeah, well, Maurice Glasman, the Labour peer, he always says on GB News, I love it when he says it, he wants a show trial, televised, with powers of arrest. The people need to see this scourge being exercised from the body politic. They need to see justice being done. And I agree. And I think your audience would agree, and I think the public agrees. When we did polling on this through Jail Partners in January, they found that the vast majority of people not only wanted an inquiry, but wanted those who covered up the abuse, as well as the perpetrators, to be jailed. They also wanted the death penalty for serious, organised child sexual exploitation perpetrators. Do I think that will happen? The death penalty, probably not.
No.
But on the misconduct in a public office, that is an offence on the books. And I think this is an extraordinary opportunity to use that offence and for the CPS to essentially get a grip of this and to flex its muscles properly for the first time on this scandal.
Because I do know, just go back to Letby, with obviously the Thirlwall inquiry with Letby, Lady Thirlwall apparently will be sending out letters to people, and there are strong rumours that there will be criminal prosecutions, possibly corporate manslaughter charges, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think for the grooming gangs inquiry, the sort of misconduct that you can find is not just like deliberate attempts to chill conversations about race or investigations, which we had in Rotherham, for example. One councillor was accused of saying they shouldn't look into taxi drivers and accused people of racism when they did so. I'm not sure that wouldn't stretch into a criminal prosecution, though of course it's revolting and they should be punished and never work in the civil service again. But when it could lead to criminal prosecutions, I think, is when people were threatened for looking into this. So we took the testimony in April of John Pecos, very brave former copper who was speaking out for the first time after 20 years. When he retired, he went to Bradford to work for a charity looking at trafficking around children's homes, found a load of evidence, gathered it for 3 months. Obviously, I triple sourced his account with the person who was working alongside him at the time, a former member of the Royal Military Police and others who were at the charity. And when John Pecos presented his findings to the police and the council at Bradford, they threatened him with arrest. They said, you're putting these children at risk, because they didn't want to rock the multicultural boat. They didn't want to spark those riots that had previously occurred. I think that sort of behaviour is where there is a possibility for further investigation. And I'm confident that the people involved in that are having a very nervous time right now.
And is part of the hesitance to deal with this issue is partly because of the cultural trends that we've been talking about, the fact that people were told for so long that this is some sort of racist conspiracy theory, so on and so forth. Just a lot of groupthink and refusing to look this crime in the face because it raised so many difficult questions about the society in which we live. But in terms of the kind of active cover-up that we're talking about, because presumably this is a large part of, consciously or unconsciously, why Labour in particular were very nervous about going near a really full-powered national inquiry, because the fact that I don't have a number for it, you'll probably have a clearer sense than me, but if you think about the towns in which so many people have heard about, Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford and so on, these are places which have been largely, if not exclusively, Labour run for a very long time. Labour councils, Labour MPs. There was this revelation that Dominic Cummings has come out with in recent weeks where he said that when he was in government at the Department for Education, working under Michael Gove, that when the Times was approaching Rotherham Council with Andrew Norfolk's reporting about what was going on, they were trying to bring legal proceedings basically against the Times. They were asking for the DfE to come on board and back them to try and snuff out this story. So there was clearly indication, shall we say, that a very explicit kind of cover-up was taking place. Is that the sort of thing that you think an inquiry could really get to grips with, or is it something which too many people have left and too many kind of files have been burnt figuratively or literally saying,
Casey's report advises authorities to not destroy any files, and you can't destroy memories, which is helpful. So, although you two are trying, you can compel people, and I think people will come forward to dob in one another out of fear, I think now, because they are concerned that someone might have a file on them. And I think it will set off a bit of a chain reaction. And what Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove told GB News about that case in Whitehall, I think we're going to have further revelations like that. And I think they will go to this inquiry and name those civil servants. They don't want to do it now on the media because, of course, that's not a safe platform to do so for all sorts of reasons. But I think they'll do it under a judge-led commission, if it is judge-led. But to the question before from Chris about how widespread is this still now? Yeah. Well, that's why the inquiry has to take place, because obviously a lot of this is non-recent, but when Suella Braverman launched that task force in the April of 2023, it found over 4,000 victims in a year and made 1,000 arrests. Now, they won't say how many of them were historic, but it is highly likely that the majority are current, because to find historic cases, generally speaking, and to build those sub-operations, that takes a long time. Yeah. Right. So for 1 year to find 1,000 arrests, that suggests a serious effort there. Operation Hydrant as well, they were saying around 700 a year of instances of group-based child sexual exploitation. 700 victims, by the way. And for each victim, that reflects many, many more perpetrators and their facilitators and those who know. And that's just from what's reported. As we know, these sorts of crimes, often the true number is hidden. For example, when the J report came out in 2014 in Rotherham, Andrew Norfolk himself did not expect it to be 1,400 that Alexis J came forward with, now revised up to 1,510 by the National Crime Agency since their Operation Stovewood in the town. So I do expect that to grow. One of the government announcements since this inquiry came to light was they also want the National Crime Agency, Britain's FBI, to lead a new sort of national effort looking into this. One of the things that we demanded in our documentary 2 years ago, because a big problem we've got, right, is that the local police are just insufficiently interested in dealing with the local crisis, right? This has been a consistent crisis, I think, for many towns.
Why is that, sorry?
Well, often they have the wrong attitudes towards the children.
They're very, very serious crimes.
They're very, very serious crimes, but they don't necessarily feel the same way. They adultify these children, who they see as sort of wayward, or 10 to 16 years old. They see it as they're essentially consenting. A lot of these places, I think...
10 to 16 years old, they think they're consenting.
They do. They generally think
that phrase child prostitutes comes up time and again. Just sort of seeing them as they're drug-addled, they've got themselves into trouble. That's like a recurring thing for all these local reports.
It was in reporting in the early 2000s, but you still hear it from figureheads quite recently. I'm not going to name any names, but people will know who I'm referring to if they've watched sort of speeches being made in the Oxford Union where they refer to child prostitution. It's insane. And more disturbingly, Chris, I think one of the bigger problems is it's not just that they have these negative attitudes. There are issues of corruption and collusion. Yeah. So we know there are cases of South Yorkshire police where abusers were being reported by victims in a police station and the abusers found out. And they would text the girl, I know you're there. I have your brother or your sister. I'm going to break his legs. I'm going to do her next if you continue this report. Now, there is no way that person would have received that text unless a police officer told them. The IOPC, the police watchdog investigation into South Yorkshire Police, found dozens of cases of gross misconduct, but the most stern punishment was a written warning. Nobody lost their jobs, nobody was sacked. 2 whistleblowers from the IOPC have recently come forward in an amazing piece of Channel 4 at the start of the year, saying that they were told, look down, not up. So this is leadership, right, in local areas. They just don't want their patch to be dirtied with this crime. So I quite like it when, say, a Mancunian copper goes to South Yorkshire, or when you get a Geordie to come down and investigate London, because they're not tainted with the same level of local links and network analysis. I think that really matters. So as recently as last week, I was in Newcastle reporting on live intelligence of grooming gangs going on there, shared with us by a local activist there. So we saw correspondence from a chief inspector telling this person, we know about this, we're acting on it, we're taking it very seriously. But then you speak to survivors from that town and they say, well, the police collapsed my investigation in 2017 because they didn't record evidence properly. Billy Basics policing errors. How on earth can they continue to do this? Continue to do this sort of work? You know, I know one officer who collapsed a case in 2017 who is still involved in this sort of stuff now. And that's why I said, please bring the NCA up here. So I think further information will come to light.
So this could be a massive house of cards. If the inquiry is really thorough, you could be looking at a huge number of arrests of police officers, potentially.
Absolutely. And I think considering how a lot of this abuse obviously is from 2 decades ago, or the last decade, officers who were detective sergeants or constables then, they're not.
They're going to be quite high up now.
Some of them aren't at that rank anymore. And I think, there'll be a bit more nervousness in those quarters as well. What were you doing in Rotherham in 2007 if you're now working elsewhere? Yeah, and you know, I've got my own testimony to work through. And I hope we can bring it forward to the inquiry at some point as well. But there are names to name, and we'll get there. But journalism, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and we'll get it right.
Absolutely. And before we move on, it feels kind of premature, or maybe overly optimistic, given everything that's happened, to ask, do you think justice is going to be done now, or whatever? But just more practically, what do you think people who are concerned about this, what should they look out for next? Where's this discussion next, the inquiry, what have you? What do you think the next stage is going to be? What should people be looking out for?
I'm terrified about the terms of reference. I'm very nervous at the terms of reference. I think we're going to see a campaign coming soon from politicians of all backgrounds, basically coming forward and presenting their own recommendations for it. We've already seen politicians shifting what they think should happen in the first few days after it was launched and announced. I mean, the Tories have now started saying they think Whitehall should be included. Quite soon after, I asked Chris Philp and Kay Badenoch if they thought Westminster should be part of this inquiry. And they sort of fudged it. And the next day they thought, we missed the trick there. Of course it should be. And now they're saying it should be. Because the recommendation is for a series of local inquiries to feed into a national inquiry. And of course, Westminster isn't a town. Could it be skipped out? Will they just do a Bradford and an isolated case? Will they get this whole national picture? So terms of reference has to look at Whitehall, but it also needs to look at the way this isn't isolated towns and cities with local inquiries needed. This is an organised crime interlinking effort, linking those 50 different towns and cities. We have revealed this year for the first time some of those trafficking links between abusers, how many of them are related. They are crime families a lot of the time. They aren't low-level, unsophisticated mates coming together to commit horrendous acts. They're clans who are linked by drug running or gun running, who then commit this heinous and barbaric torture on white girls as a sort of a side gig, another moneymaker. So that has to be captured in this investigation, or it'll be another missed opportunity.